Okay, sir. What is your name?
I'm Reverend C.T.Vivian.
How were you involved with the civil rights movement?
I was National Director of Affiliates on Dr. King's executive staff.
How long was that?
I joined the movement at the time of Birmingham and stayed with it through the March on Washington all the way through Chicago.
What was your relationship with Martin Luther King?
Well, all of us who were on the executive staff had a personal relationship with Martin.
Okay. Do you know Reverend A.D. King?
Oh yes, knew A.D. King, and you couldn't help but know A.D. King. He was the kind of personality that once you knew you knew him, and because Martin was his brother, you had another reason for knowing him.
If you were to tell the world who A.D. King is, what would you tell the world? Because he's hardly known, but I also understand he's a legend in the movement. What is your response to that?
Well, it is difficult to describe A.D., and the first thing you have to say, of course, is that they were brothers. The second thing you have to say is, so that people don't miss it, that they were surrounded by the same family. Now, most people would say you take that for granted, but you can't take it for granted when the father is as powerful a personality as Daddy King, or that his mother, who was a fine and unusual woman in her own right. And it's too bad nothing's been written about, or very little has been written about her as well. So that you have to weave all that in and much more to understand A.D.
I understand A.D. was a reverend and he was also a preacher.
Oh yes, A.D. and a pastor.
And
that's a unique difference. Because to simply say one is a minister in our times may mean anything. But to say you were a pastor of a church, and churches in his case, right, tells a great deal about your understanding of people, and your ability to work with people, and your ability to relate to people. And of course he had that kind of capacity for things, but he should have. I mean, see, he also had a grandfather as well as a father who was a pastor.
What role did A.D. play during the movement?
Well, A.D. was, in one sense, you could say that he traveled with Martin every now and then, and was always ready to do that. And you might also say that he was on many scenes where Martin was. But more important is that he started a whole housing movement in Louisville. And Martin came in to be helpful to it. But that housing movement in Louisville was A.D.'s idea, A.D.'s force, A.D.'s leadership ability was shown there.
As a personal friend, how would you describe him?
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that I would describe A.D. as a person who history happened to place on the scene. I do not think that he would have been operative if it had not been for his brother, if it had not been his brother's movement. And I don't think his father would have been involved if it was not his son's movement, right? But they all knew Martin as brilliant, and they understood that they had a role in that, right? And that they were a part of that in ways that a family is that others don't know about.
Did you know about AD's activities in Birmingham, Alabama in the 60s?
Yeah, very little of it, very truthfully. And I was in Birmingham. In fact, was the first to go into Birmingham, Wyatt T. Walker and I. Wyatt T. was there and I came in right after him, right? He was there as a pastor. He was really in the town next to Birmingham. He wasn't really in Birmingham. What was the name of the
Ensley.
Ensley. He was in Ensley. This is where he was really pastoring. And he hadn't been there too long, so he had to pay attention to business in Ensley as well as to think about the movement, right?
Yes.
But he shared in the movement in Birmingham, even though he was pastoring in Ensley.
Were you aware about the bombing of his home in Birmingham, and how did people react to such violence against a man of peace?
Let's put it this way, the reaction was always that of having to end racism. Is that, you know, it was often called Birmingham, not Birmingham. It was a way of changing it around to show the method that the Ku Klux Klan used there. That was supposed to intimidate people so that they would not do this or would not do the other. And it did not work because we had a movement, and the public was so definitely involved that nothing was going to stop because of the bombing. In fact, they bombed churches and homes and everything else in Birmingham, but it didn't stop anyone.
What was the strategy that was used by the movement in those days that made it so successful?
Well, nonviolent direct action was the method. In fact, and they never stopped using nonviolent direct action. In fact, Martin made it very clear that the whole world could stop if they wanted to, but he was not going to do so. And that even organizations that were working with us that wanted to talk about something else, Martin would let them know that it was nonviolent direct action that made the difference in everything. His brother and his family and all the rest of us, his movement family as well as his blood family, was very clear that this was the way to go. Now, I also have to say that had it not been for Martin's deep commitment to nonviolence, none of the rest, both either family or public, would have been involved in nonviolent direct action.
Also, I want you to tell the young folks, because I know in those days there were both young and old that participated in the movement. What was the strategy that you used in those days to galvanize the people to be sensitive to the movement and become actually a part of the movement?
Well, see, once people began to become aware that we were talking about centuries of people that had waited and had worked and waited to overcome racism, that they owed their ancestry to move forward. Now, one must see that the most important thing about Montgomery was the proving of nonviolent direct action. That is what had to be brought to every city we were in. And that the people who didn't use nonviolent direct action didn't do anything that was lasting, right? When you think of the most important things that happened in the movement, they happened because of nonviolent direct action. The method was given to us, and that the major battles were done in Alabama, of which being a member of the family was very important. number one thing was Montgomery. In Montgomery, we got the method and proved the method.
Why Montgomery? Why not New York?
There's no reason why. The only way you can say a why is because nothing could happen in New York. You didn't have to worry about that.
Was that part of the strategy?
We should have said, no, I mean, see, first things happen is that then you begin to work with what you got. There were people that demonstrated before, but they were not deeply involved in nonviolent direct action. In the South even. I did it in the North, but I did not, and we opened up all the lunch counters and restaurants and so forth in Peoria, Illinois. And I was a leader in that. But after a while, we didn't know what to do. The great thing about Martin is that he kept that ball rolling up the hill for over 15 years, right? And never let it stop. But now, here again, where things happen becomes very important. In the South was where the struggle was. The people can talk all they want to about the North. Because Northerners were thinking, black Northerners were thinking that they were free, and knowing better, but trying to cover themselves. In the South, everybody, no matter how much they had or what their degrees were or what their jobs or anything, knew that they were not free and that they could be killed at any moment and nothing would be done about it. Quite different scene. Martin worked against that. That was always as much for him as for anybody else. This is why A.D.'s home was bombed, right? The idea was to make certain that he doesn't do what Martin was doing, right? Alabama tried very hard to stop any action there. A friend of mine named Billups, they took him out of his car out on a stretch of highway and beat him and tied him to a tree, but they didn't do it very well because they thought that he was near dead anyway. But he crawled out on the highway, right? And and just took a chance that the cars would see him. He was sprawled on the highway, and the lights came on. And they took him to the hospital and saved his life. My point being is that there were a number of people, and that the spirit of Birmingham was so great that everybody was involved, and that they could not be stopped. And as you were a pastor of a church, like A.D. was in Inslee, that's far more than being just a member of a church. It's far more than being, you had a whole following of people that were looking to you. And in Inslee and many of those small places around, in the rural areas in particular, they were concerned about anybody who was in movement bringing the message. And A.D. was one of those persons who did that.
What role did spirituality play in the civil rights movement?
Well, you see, we were all ministers. That has to be seen beginning, all right? And the second thing you have to see is that nonviolent direct action is a spiritual concept. It is not a military concept. It is a spiritual concept. It's a method of fighting off evil that is exactly the opposite of how 99% of people perceive that you have to fight. But Martin said it so well that violence creates more problems than it solves. Right? Violence creates more problems than it solves.
Which means the spirit of the Lord was very significant in the success of the movement. Would you agree with that?
What was that?
The Spirit of the Lord, faith, was a leading factor.
In fact, see, this is why SCLC is around and all the rest of them are not. If you notice, those who said and took on nonviolence as an idea or a concept, none of them are still here. those that took it on as a way of life are still here and are still leading movements one way or the other. Because it was spiritually deep in them. It wasn't simply something to do or as a cover for activity. It grew out, the activity grew out of their concepts, of their spiritual and moral and spiritual concepts. That's what has to be seen. And the core is no longer here. SNCC is no longer here. And when John Lewis left left SNCC because of arguments around the very issue of nonviolence, right? Is that, in my thinking, that was the beginning of the end for SNCC, not just because John was not there, but because there was no one who was committed to nonviolence there and that could stand up and talk about it and be clear on it, right? That is a necessity as we look at the struggles in the South.
What is the status from your point of view of the current LCLC in terms of leadership and strategy? Because I know that the foundation of the LCLC in those days was rooted in faith. Is that still the same today, or is something different?
Well, one has to watch how they answer such a question, because you don't want to condemn anyone necessarily, because they're not that bad. They need condemning. But I do not believe that there is any organization that could have the depth of spirituality or the depth of nonviolence as method as we had then, but because we had Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And there's no substitute for that.
Well said, well said. Let's talk about...
In fact, Martin King became the prophet of our age. There's no other way to say that.
People call AD the brother to the dreamer.
Sure.
What's your reaction to that?
I think it's a great line. He was exactly that. He was the brother to the dreamer. But he was always in the shadow of course. I mean, everybody was in the shadow of Martin King. By the way, Martin King was so great that he is the only non-president on the mall in Washington, D.C. Only non-president, black or white or any other color or any other ethnic group or any other, right? Is that that shows how great he was. And being black and being there tells you that it was doubly difficult, more difficult for him to get there than if he had been white, right? So that it's unfair to make comparisons with A.D. or anybody else with Martin King.
I think you're right about that. I don't think the intent here is to have any comparison, but just to acknowledge those sheroes and heroes that work with Martin along the field. People like you, people like Dr. Lowry, people like all other dignitaries that actually put their lives on the line.
Well, are now dignitaries.
Yes.
Now, that has to be seen, and that's what the young people, for instance, as you mentioned before, must see. And anybody who wasn't here must see. They see them as dignitaries now, but they weren't dignitaries then. In fact, they were seen as enemies of the state. They were seen as traitors to a nation, right? Because the nation did not want to admit it was wrong, right? Is that Martin proved that they were wrong and proved that we were right.
What has changed now?
Oh, everything has changed. There's nothing that is the same as what it was. And this is what everyone has to see, is that there is no excuse for anyone living today, whether they were living then, as I am, or but very few of them are my age, or whether they came afterwards, right? There's no excuse, because if it was done then, and we were only a short time out of slavery, right, and still fought for freedom, there is no excuse for it.
What is your advice for young folks who are sitting on the sideline and just watching and not participating in the civil rights movement?
Number one, if they want to become the men or women they could become, they must be involved in the struggle against racism. Number one, that's what made all the dignitaries that they now see as dignitaries people worthy of having their names repeated. I don't care who you were, is that you didn't become a part of the movement because you were so great, right? In fact, many of the so-called dignitaries then were afraid to be a part of the movement, were afraid to stand up, were afraid to do anything other than fall in line with what white America wanted, right? What white America wanted was antithetical to what black people had to have, right? But at least they saw themselves as the exception that was getting along, right? Well, it's not a matter of getting along. It's a matter of freeing a nation. And Martin understood that in the process, we were freeing white people as well as black people. The proof that white people understand that is the fact that Martin King's on the mall. And that the holiday is named after him. Special day in his honor. All the rest of the things that make it very clear. The Nobel Peace Prize, the world acknowledges Martin King. They too, if they can find a strategy to change relationships between people for the good of all, right? They now have proof that they too can make it. This is what Obama's about. The first question Obama asked me when we started a conversation, he said, "How did you guys do it?" And so I waited for a couple moments before I answered, because I wanted him to understood is that we didn't just do it, all right? That God was with us, and that if you have the courage to go out and struggle for what's right and just, even though your life may be in question, is that God works with you in ways that are beyond easy description, and certainly beyond your taking credit for it.
That is very inspirational. Time has changed. This is one of the moments in history that the United States will have an African American presented at the Democratic National Party as the nominee, and maybe the next president of the United States of America. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, it's exactly like you said it. But it also says how powerful nonviolence is. And that's what we have to understand. It's the strategy. When presented by Martin, who's the prophet of our age, right, is that it's different than simply saying there's nonviolence and not. But in fact, I don't even use nonviolence separate from direct action, because you see, these two have to go together, or you're really being philosophical with your nonviolence. You're not proving anything, and you're really not doing anything that's worthwhile to change people's relationships, or change the law, or change opportunities for people. That's what Martin was about, right? Kingian nonviolence demands action. That you must act it out. You must use your nonviolence for higher aims, to create a better society. Martin said it in in the last chapter, where do we go from here? And it must be seen is that, for instance, the agenda, the Kingian agenda is still here. And if AD was here, it would be his agenda too, right? Is that the end of racism, the end of poverty, and the end of war. And you can't say in that order. Martin made it clear. You had to work on all of them at once. As long as you were going to have war, you couldn't have, you really couldn't end any one of the other two. You certainly couldn't end poverty. We're seeing it played out. We have a president, still is a president, right, who was exactly opposite of Martin King. He didn't hear a message from the 1960s at all. If you don't hear the prophet of your age, you're going to be wrong in everything you do. Right? So he immediately not only goes to war, he jumps on a country simply because he wants a war. He wants to steal their oil instead of buy it at the price it was worth. He wanted to take over a country. Opposite of Martin King's method, Martin King's thinking, Martin King's understanding of himself and of the world around him. Right? So what happens is that we now live in a country which is being destroyed financially because we didn't obey his struggle against war. Remember, he was doing all these at once. At the same time, he was fighting against racism. He was also fighting against war, right?
Yes.
And he was the first one to have a poverty program where he went to Washington, set up Resurrection City. He was doing all of these because you must work on all of them to end any of them.
Tell me about the Operation Breadbasket.
Operation Breadbasket was the beginning of the economic programs of Martin King. In fact, actually, Martin had the good sense and the insight and the understanding to see that program worked in Cleveland under another minister and under another group of ministers. Right? See, it's God's people. Huh? It's the ministry that has made the difference. And it has been the Christian ministry in this case, right? But it'll always be for true change, you have to create moral and spiritual concepts and ideals out of which you work, right? Because without it, you're not going to be able to be radical enough to make the change, nor will it be massive enough. And the things you will want and work for won't be basic enough, right? All right. I used to give speeches around those three words because that's it. Religious and moral and spiritual, a moral and spiritual movement. That's what we had. We didn't have. Martin King wasn't into a political movement. He was in a moral and spiritual movement. That's what he was about, right? Of which the change of law was only a first step. Right? And you have to see that in terms of what it means to truly be a Kingian person.
Will you say then that poverty is a moral issue rather than economic and social issue?
You see it all the way through the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. You can't love your brother and see him wallow in poverty. In fact, poverty is not created by people. Poverty is overcome by people who think right. All right? The people who create public policy decide. If a nation goes along with public policy that creates poverty, as Martin King said, there's something wrong with the nation. that creates poverty.
What was Poor People's Campaign all about, in which Martin was killed in Memphis?
It's about ending the drive for money for the sake of money. It's about ending materialism as the guideline for a nation. It is about understanding that all humankind is worthy of proper treatment, and that a nation or a people cannot be great until they help develop all other people within the society. Right? Is that our role is to help everybody that is around us. That's what it's about. Is that now some of us can do more than others. Martin King, prophet of our age. There isn't a person in the United States that lived then or live now, right, that doesn't owe Martin King, whether they be black, white, yellow, pink, or polka dot, right, is because he turned this nation around so that it could properly serve God. Right? See, is that the Christian church still has to encounter a true religion, true moral and spiritual understandings of Jesus, much less of others. Is that the world cannot be changed until we make our moral and spiritual life more important than any other, and that we don't see it as a personal thing as much as we see it as a societal thing, and that we fit into it based upon the depth of our faith. You cannot be a powerful change agent by simply going along with the old way of doing things. There has to, and what Martin was bringing us was a new moral and spiritual basis for the entire society, so that it went past talk and became something you did, the action component, that you do it, you prove it's right. Is that we had to be beaten to prove to America how wrong they were. And when they saw people being beat by persons that were supposed to represent law and order, they knew that they were dealing with cheap law and no order at all. That the kind of order that they're dealing with was inhuman. It is these kinds of understandings that become basic to the movement and to all who participate. And although everyone couldn't say it as well as Martin, right, is that they followed him as proof of what they were about.
Daddy King said at the funeral service of AD that they killed both of my sons for civil rights activism, but love conquers evil and I forgive them. That was very inspirational to me. Can you respond to that?
Well, yes, I can respond to it, but it's not going to be like most people think of it. The important thing here in that statement is that he was a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The important thing in that statement was that the two people he was talking about also were. The important thing is that he was talking about that the people who did it were evil, whether they were church members or not. They still didn't represent Jesus, right? But that he and his sons did, right? In fact, his son converted him to the higher level that was necessary for becoming fully a Christian in our society. You don't become fully a Christian by saying, I believe in Jesus. You have to prove you believe in Jesus by what you do. Now, there are theologians that want to say, oh, no, 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 you don't have to do anything. All you have to do is say, I believe in Jesus. But they don't understand is that when you said you believe in the years that was being said that Jesus is on earth, that meant that you followed that belief. And that you lived it daily. And that you thought of it as the very basis of your relationship with God. I like to ask racists and people who don't even think they're racist, have you ever got down on your knees and asked God's forgiveness for your attitudes toward black people? Have you ever got down on your knees and asked God for forgiveness? Not in some ceremony where you read it off of a piece of paper, but down on your knees in your own closet, as the scripture calls it, right? Your own inner sense. And ask God for forgiveness, meaning not that I can get by with asking him every 15 minutes. I don't mean that. I mean ask for forgiveness, knowing that you were wrong and that you're going to change the way you live. That's the necessity for the beginning of the proper spiritual journey and changing one's life. That is what conversion really means. That you're changing what you were to what Christ would have you become.
Christian Harris King stated that my two brothers died mysteriously. And we knew that A.D. was an excellent swimmer, but they said he drowned in his own swimming pool. What's your take on that?
I want all of us to understand, for we have never searched yet. We have never done for A.D. what we did for Martin King to find out about his murder, to examine every detail. That must be done with A.D. There's a great mystery around A.D.'s death. There is great hidden information yet to be brought out around A.D.'s death. And until it is, we will not be fair to A.D., nor to the movement, nor to the concepts, nor to the Christian ministry, or to his family.
If you were to tell the world in a nutshell a characterization of who A.D. was and his contribution to the movement, what would it be?
I can't do that. Is that this is why I know you're going to crop this.
Okay, we're going to remove that question.
You're getting back to where I've already answered.
We're going to remove that question. Now, Let me ask one more question here. The movement today, as it is, especially in 2007, when Gina happened in Louisiana about the snows in 2007, I believe, it was an awakening call to almost everybody that we cannot tolerate or the kind of thing that happens in the past that we try to get rid of. And the young folks stood up and stood in and marched and went in droves to Gina. A lot has happened since then. I want you to address the young folks now that this is their time and encourage them that it is a civic responsibility to stand up for your right and to attain freedom.
All the way through this, we have been speaking to youth. And right now, they must understand that going to China said that they were willing but that's not enough. For there has been no follow through on it. The mayor and the rest of people in Gina have gotten by with what they wanted to get by with anyway. The movement didn't last long enough bring the nation in on it. They have not yet learned what Martin learned and must study a whole movement. The idea of marching, we didn't march until the time was right. And I don't mean in terms of areas, arenas, or whole years, but until we planned and worked and set up set up a whole movement in a city and continued it until the city changed. We let them go. I believe that there were adults that came in on it that were only concerned about media and PR. I believe in so doing, they took the movement for themselves and let that be enough. And that's not enough, and especially for Gina. When I heard that Gina happened the next day, I didn't hear it, I don't believe the first day, but at least part of the first day, second day. I heard it on TV first, right? And then when I really heard it coming from people and saw people organizing it, right? Then I said, wow, they have proven, this generation has proven that they are ready. But you see, that generation must lead for itself, right? And for them to listen to people who have been lifted but not necessarily in the action, right? Well, I don't want to say that, so cut that little phrase in there, not necessarily in the action. But but have not proven that they really understand nonviolence. Is not to do nonviolent direct action. Simply to not be hit, or to be hit and not strike back is not nonviolence. Nonviolence is an entire process where you continue it with all of its points intact until you win the struggle you start with. And Gina hasn't been won. It proved that there is within this generation, I call it the freedom generation, but it can't be the freedom generation until it takes on the whole task and fulfills the action, proves to itself in the world that they will not put up with. All they really proved, or what they really proved is a better way of saying it. What they really proved is that the idea is there within them, but they're not yet committed to the follow-through.
Well spoken. The last question, this is an observation. We elect a lot of African Americans. We have over 300 mayors. We have thousands of elected African American officials, and yet we have racial profiling. And poverty still exists in our territory.
Well, we haven't chosen poverty as an issue yet.
Yes.
You see, this is what I mean by you have to see the entire Martin King agenda. And the entire Martin King agenda is, the entire Martin King agenda is what is important. You see what I'm saying? Is that and until it is done, we have no true concept of freedom as was seen in the mind and understood in the heart of a Martin King. The goals are totally different. The main goal in America is we say it's democracy, but we don't believe And people come to this country not because they're concerned about America, they're concerned about the money, right? So that that's not enough. Those are goals that are cheap in relationship to Martin's goal. Martin's goal was to create the beloved community, a totally different concept that takes a lot more of the overturning of this society, causing it to live up to what its real statements are, both religiously and politically.
Awesome. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Vivian. This has been an inspiring interview, and thank you.